All right, why don't we get started? I see that all of our illustrious guests are here. Thank you all very much for joining us for this afternoon's town hall, our policy town hall on COVID-19 response. I am Ben Kershaw with Independent Sector. For those of you who are joining us for the first time on an IS online learning event, welcome. Independent Sector is a national membership organization representing a diverse set of nonprofits, foundations, and corporate giving programs working to ensure that all people in the United States thrive. Today, joined by Wes Coulam as well as by Renee Bender, two special guests that I will introduce to you in a moment. As part of our webinar feature, all lines are currently muted, and we will pause periodically for questions. You can ask questions through the Q&A box if you're joining us through Zoom, or you may email them to publicpolicy@independentsector.org. You'll have a much better shot through the Q&A box. This webinar is recorded and will be posted on the Independent Sector website, and it'll be emailed to you within 24 hours. When you leave today's webinar, you'll be asked to take a survey. We hope you'll take it to help us better tailor content to your needs. So we look forward to your questions today. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to note and emphasize that this event is off the record for press purposes. Members of the media may contact media@independentsector.org for more information, but this is off the record for press purposes. We appreciate your understanding. This event and events like it are often and historically membership events for Independent Sector members. That is not the case right now because of the urgency of the moment that we're in, but if you are interested in Independent Sector membership, we would sure love to have you and love to continue working with you as we go forward. So now I want to introduce our guests. I am joined, as so often, by our trusted friend and colleague, Wes Coulam, Managing Director at Washington Counsel, Ernst & Young. Everyone, I think, who joins us regularly is familiar with Wes's expertise on tax policy. What sometimes gets left out by our community is that Wes also is a former staff director of the Senate Committee on Small Business and Entrepreneurship. Especially in this moment, as so many of us are learning about SBA, we're really glad to have Wes with us. Our guests this afternoon also really excited to have Renee Bender with us. Renee is Senior Professional Staff on the Small Business Committee in the Senate. Renee manages the SBA lending and investment portfolios, as well as a number of other issues for the committee. She previously served on the committee under Chairman Jim Risch. She worked for Senator Mike Enzi, and as a native New Mexican, she served for Senator Pete Domenici as well. So thank you, Wes. Thank you, Renee, for being with us. Renee, as you all can imagine, is incredibly busy right now, even busier maybe than we would have expected today, with some breaking developments that I'm sure we'll hear about from her. Renee, before we turn to what's happening on the Hill at this moment and this afternoon, I want to start with a minor step back. As I mentioned, a lot of us have learned a lot about the SBA in the last couple months, which is a nice way of saying that the nonprofit sector is still getting to know the SBA. This agency is obviously not new to you or to Chairman Rubio. Can you talk a little bit about maybe how the chairman sees the role of the SBA in general? And as we look at the CARES Act under so much scrutiny right now, what were your goals in shaping the CARES Act? Thanks so much for being with us, Renee.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks for having me. And I'm thrilled to be on here with Wes and joining all of you today. It's really a pleasure. Thank you for the question. I think I would first say that Chairman Rubio, when he took over the committee last January, really looked at what is, what are all of the SBA's programs? What are they doing? When was the last time we looked at them? So we haven't really updated the small business program since about the year 2000. So we undertook a giant reauthorization process. And I think that was a good opportunity for a lot of people, even members, new members, to kind of get to know the SBA and its programs, frankly. So that was a great sort of precursor to, I think, the level of activity that we've had most recently with the CARES Act. And what we really have come to in terms of the SBA and its role is that the SBA's programs really do fill a gap in the private market. So the lending programs, they're government guaranteed programs that provide loans to small businesses. And usually, in normal times, the gateway into those programs is the inability for that small business to obtain credit elsewhere. So they can't get a loan on conventional terms that would meet the needs of their business. It's the same with the Small Business Investment Company and some of the other programs that are provided, the microloan program. They're all there to really fill gaps in the private marketplace that aren't being met for our smallest of small businesses. So when you take that lens and then we move forward to what is currently happening in our country, we obviously have seen just, this unprecedented shutdown of the economy. And so the impetus really and the thought behind the program when we start behind the payroll protection program that's in CARES that we undertook about, I guess, four weeks ago now, hard to believe, was to really try to do the best that we could to create a program that would help small businesses. And again, our edict was to provide these funds for small businesses, to try to do the best we could to maintain an employer-employee relationship, so that as all of these public health closures continued, and we see revenues going out the window and all of these things happening across the country, that we would provide a mechanism for these forgivable loans for small businesses to keep their staff and pay them even while they're closed, to really maintain those relationships. And then in a situation where, eventually our economy is opening back up, that those relationships are maintained and those employees can return to work. Now, part of the payroll protection program also includes the ability to use some of those funds for fixed debt obligations like mortgage, rent, and all of those things, understanding that small businesses are going to need funds to do that as well. And so in that conversation, we really looked at who, for the first time ever, opening up a small business program to nonprofit entities, which prior to the payroll protection program, nonprofits had been considered passive businesses and were unable to receive funding through SBA, aside from those microloans, which are $50,000 and less.
Got it. Okay. I think that's an important point, really worth emphasizing. Just how new this relationship between the nonprofit sector and the SBA is. And so I think there's a lot of, maybe a lot of growing pains, like with any new relationship. But I think, and I hope that the nonprofit sector is approaching this, as a major policy victory and a show of support from Congress for the sector as well. So nonprofit organizations have been particularly focused on the program you mentioned, the Paycheck Protection Program. And we have a lot of mixed results and some concern maybe about getting left out. I think those concerns are even more urgent, this afternoon than they were this time yesterday. Can you give us a sense of how implementation's going and your take on the news that we've seen today about the program itself?
Sure. I think, the behemoth task here has been to not only set up a program to create a program like this in the short amount of time that we had while working through the CARES Act in the Senate and then the House passing that package, but then the very short period of time with which that program has been stood up. So keeping in mind that the CARES Act was signed into law on March 27th, and the payroll protection program was open on April 3rd, just 1 week later. And so I think some of the natural hiccups that we've seen in standing up a program this large. Is this rolling guidance process that has happened, I think, has caused some confusion for lenders, for borrowers. How do I count these employees? Which employees can I count? You know, just you name it, there's a question about it. There's you know, obviously hiccups when something this big is being rolled out. But to your point about the situation we're in today, is that lenders have certainly risen to the challenge, and borrowers have certainly had an appetite for this product, because we are now in a situation where the obligations that could be made for these loans has been met. So we do have, I believe the as of about 10:15 this morning, the SBA signaled that we had reached the full number of approvals that they could take. So effectively sort of start shutting the program down absent further funding. So of course there are those conversations ongoing as we speak about what that looks like. And, you know, we're really hopeful for some action this afternoon. I don't have a specific timeline or a result. Those conversations are certainly happening at the leadership level to try to figure that out. But certainly there's been an appetite for this. There's the need, and we're trying to do our best to work quickly and meet the, you know, as we get concerns from nonprofits, small businesses, small banks, if they're having trouble getting to SBA systems, you name it, we've tried to troubleshoot as much as we can, and those relationships with SBA and with Treasury to sort of address these issues as they've come up. So I think we, you know, for the time frame that this program has been in existence, it has been, you know, with some challenges, but also with incredible amount of result for affected businesses.
It is just, you know, stunning to think that this $350 billion program was signed into law on March 27th, as you say. I think on April 3rd, so many of us were frustrated that it didn't work perfectly, and I think that's really important context. So thank you for that. So you mentioned that the program's out of money right now. You know, you put it much more articulately than that. So there are negotiations happening. As you noted, you know, you're not sure exactly what the clear path forward is. Can you tell us a little bit about Chairman Rubio's perspective on what ought to happen? I mean, do you think, you know, we ought to just cleanly add more money to this? Are you looking to make tweaks to this program as part of that, you know, re-upping? What's you and your boss's perspective on maybe how to tackle this?
Sure. I think, you know, certainly we've gotten just numerous and innumerable feedback from all sectors of, you know, things that could be improved, ways we could, technical changes, more substantive policy changes that people would like to see. And we are really gathering all of those, keeping those. I think one of the challenges we have right now is that most areas, Washington, D.C. is under a stay-at-home order. And we will be through a large portion of May. And so the Senate and the House are both in recess, having these, you know, pro forma sessions where they can do some business until May 4th. And so in order for us to sort of get some more funding into the program without requiring all of the members to come back to DC for a vote, what leadership is really trying to do, and what I think Chairman Rubio has asked to do, is to add some money to the pot so those small businesses and those nonprofits who are in the queue, who are trying to get these loans, have access to them. And we don't know what the future may hold in terms of whether it's a phase 4 or a CARES 2.0. We've all heard various you know, comments about that, but we will absolutely be looking at technical and other changes if the opportunity arises for us to make them to the PPP. But for the time being, we're really just focused on making sure that there are funds there for small businesses to apply for. And in order to do that, really does have to be a clean increase in order to get that unanimous consent in the Senate.
Got it. Okay, I think that's really helpful context to think about. So, you know, you mentioned this urgent need to add more funding to the program, but that whether it's in a 2.0 or a 4.0 or whatever, you know, numerical system we're using, that there may be room for changes. I know, Renee, that you've seen a letter from a few hundred national nonprofit organizations about some changes that our community thinks are essential in any forthcoming legislation around the CARES Act. Some of those are changes outside the jurisdiction of the Small Business Committee, things like expanding the universal charitable deduction, for example. But a few of the things that our community is working on within the committee's jurisdiction center around the 500 employee cap for nonprofit organizations, as well as dedicated funding potentially for nonprofit organizations within this program. How do you think we're going to do on those? What's your thinking around those issues, and how might we maybe work on trying to address some of the problems underlying those issues together?
Sure. I think, we have heard from a number of nonprofits. Obviously we were only covering those organized as 501c3s, and those veterans organizations organized as 501c19s explicitly in the statute. And so we have heard from a number of other of nonprofits that are organized in different ways, whether that's a C6 or C12 or what have you, for inclusion in future consideration. And we're certainly taking that under advisement. I think, we will be, we did, I think, the best that we could do with the optics that we had 4 weeks ago, but certainly the world looks very different today than it did 4 weeks ago. And the covered period that we have in the CARES Act for the PPP is through June 30th. And now we're seeing that there are, some states that have stay-at-home orders through June. And what does that look like? So I think there are a lot of questions. There's certainly the need. The need is undoubtedly there. I think we'll always end up with questions about what we're asked to cover in the PPP. Are leaders, are leaders in the House and Senate interested in expanding that outside of sort of that small business size standard? I think that's a question that we don't have the answer to right now, but certainly been asked. And then how, expanded eligibility. And I think the issue that we'll always run into with these types of things is a funding issue. Is just how much money is going to be allocated for this program, and then who are we being asked to cover under that cap. So those are some of the considerations, and I don't think there's any easy answers, but I think that it's very much the case that the chairman and those that he's worked with, and which has been a bipartisan group, Senator Cardin, Senator Collins, Senator Shaheen. Certainly we work very closely with Chairwoman Velasquez in the House side. It's important for us to have those conversations and to talk about those different size standards. I think size will be a big topic of conversation, and I do think that is totally within the realm of understanding the magnitude of what we're dealing with right now. But in the first round, we were small business focused, and so that overarching is 500 and below. So a lot of this will depend on what the universe of things is, right, for what we'd be asked to sort of, what the chairman would be asked to think through in covering what businesses to cover. I think that we have requests for set-asides from a lot of different groups. That one's a little bit tougher, to be frank, because then it's sort of a question of how do you pick winners and losers of who gets a dedicated pot of money to draw from. So just from a staff perspective, that one's a little bit tougher to grapple with. But I certainly think there's been a lot more discussion about what does that employee threshold look like. So we're happy to engage with you all further on that, as well as people have questions and concerns they want to share with us.
We really appreciate that. So you mentioned the 500 employee threshold. I think it was, when, again, for a community still getting fully familiar with the SBA, there's the 500 employee threshold that's in the statute, or there are other employee size standards. And, I think some in our community look at that list of size standards and think, well, hey, right, some of those numbers are larger than 500. And there are some particularly, maybe politically less sympathetic industries on that list, even than the nonprofit sector. Can you tell us, just from a, maybe a more of a technical standpoint, how did that list come together? What's that list based on? Who do we need to talk to about, maybe getting on that list?
Yeah, I think this does really truly for nonprofits go back to the issue that SBA hasn't had a huge amount of interaction with nonprofits in the past outside of, to my knowledge, this microloan program. And so the SBA, there's size standards that are employee-based at SBA, and there's size standards that are revenue-based. There's a lot of confusion about that. What does it mean if you have a revenue-based size standard where you have 37.5 million is your revenue-based size standard? And so in conversations with members, the thought was, let's make it as simple as possible and keep this a straight employee standard. And so the universal standard that people know of, if they know of a small business size standard, is that 500 employees generally across the board. Now, where the nuance that you mention is that SBA has a number of industries who have an employee-based size standard that is higher than 500. So you have those that may be manufacturing intensive, that they have an employee size standard up to 1,200 or 1,500 that is still considered a small business. And so what we have in the PPP and the CARES Act is that for businesses who have an employee-based size standard that is above 500, we're not going to, because that is your SBA size standard, that you are permitted to use your size standard. We're not going to cut you out because you're able to access SBA's programs with the size of employees that you have. And for everyone else, it's 500 employees. And so for a lot of businesses, their revenue size standard, if they go and look at employees, they have, under the employee size standard. So if we had used a revenue-based size standard, they may have gotten cut out, but in the way that we used it, they're able to access the program. So we're trying to make it simple, but not disadvantage those who have an SBA size standard that is larger. So I understand there's some question about how that works out, but we're trying to be as fair as possible to everybody and keep it simple for eligibility determination.
Hey, Renee, thanks for all your comments. This is Wes Coulam. I'm just going to jump in and ask a quick question of you. The sector has been kind of going back and forth with the banking industry trying to get in on the PPP program. Do you have any data that you've had from the SBA so far on how the nonprofit sector has been able to get loans or get their applications in, or is that something that's possible to get from SBA on a going forward basis to kind of get a sense of what the nonprofit sector is able to participate in the program on a going forward basis?
I think that's a great question. We have just gotten sort of some state specific numbers for the amount of loans approved at the state level. And that information took a little bit for SBA to come up with. So I do think that we will be asking for, sector specific data in the coming weeks. It's just not something that we have now. I think it's also a challenge of when the loan approval, like we're not quite sure what SBA is gathering from the loan application piece through the E-Tran system, where they're going through, and whether they'll be able to siphon that information from the top end, or if it would come in through lenders submit a monthly form to SBA on the disbursements that they've made. And so whether that'll come in on the disbursement form that they submit to SBA once a month. So it's trying to figure out how to get the data, but the point is very well taken, and we'll certainly be asking for nonprofit specific data.
That's great. That's great. Thank you. Also on the lender side, some of the nonprofits don't have traditional banking relationships and relationships with a lot of the larger banks. They might bank with other non-traditional banks potentially. I know the statute allowed the expansion of SBA lenders to be broader. How have you seen that going? So more financial institutions that nonprofits might be able to bank with, or bank with, currently able to access the program through them going forward?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. I think we've seen through the, we have the ability for SBA to approve new lenders, and then a whole process for Treasury to approve new both bank and non-bank lenders. And I think we've run into some snags on the non-bank lender side in terms of some of the requirements on, deposits and those types of things And so we are very keyed in on this issue, and the chairman's been very personally keyed in on this to make sure that no matter where you are, who you bank with, you're able to have access to PPP equally. So we've done a lot of work on the CDFI side, for example. We have a number of CDFIs who are in the SBA's program already because they use the SBA's 7A Community Advantage program or other similar programs at the SBA. So they're able to do loans. We had some issues with different CDFIs being unable to, you know, just general, like they couldn't get into the E-Tran. And so we worked through those with SBA to make sure they're online. But it has been more of a challenge in getting more folks approved with some of the banking parameters that have been placed there. And so we're working through that now. And I know a lot of members are very interested in this, and so it's a bipartisan issue. So I think moving forward, it'll be really important for us to work with Treasury and you know, with our colleagues, with one another, whether it's through Treasury initially on some additional guidance, or you know, in their approval process, or also in whatever, if we're able to make any changes in a future bill, what that looks like, to make sure that some of these lenders are able to get on board and provide PPP to their constituency. So that's point is very well taken. So we're trying to work through it the best we can through it, you know, administratively right now, and then looking at what we might need to do down the line.
Great. Thank you.
So Renee, we've had a few questions and comments come in. First, I think a comment that you're welcome to react to is I think one of the challenges around the threshold is that it's such a black and white cutoff for organizations. There's no phase out. Again, for a lot of us who work in tax policy, we're used to things phasing out. And so I think that that's just something that our sector, including one of our listeners today, is raising as a challenge, especially as we think about, you know, the application of that threshold with part-time staff, you know, and others and other staff. But a question for you. We've heard a lot. We've been talking a lot today about the PPP. The EIDL program in the CARES Act. Is there any additional money coming online or anticipated to need to come online to support the functioning of that program? We've seen sort of some mixed press reports about how quickly that program's working.
Yeah. So I'll first say something to the comment. It's very well taken on the full-time, part-time. I think we've actually had a number of questions specific to the nonprofit side of things, different groups that we've heard from. And so I think that'll definitely be a topic of conversation about being more specific if we're able to make changes in the future about who counts as part-time. You know, the person who comes in and does 2 hours of you know, some work at a nonprofit and you know, does that. So trying to be a little bit more prescriptive about what that FTE versus part-time versus other sort of equivalency looks like. So we've heard that a number of times. So please know that we're aware that's an issue and we're kind of thinking through it now. So people have suggestions. We're very open to it. In terms of EIDL, I think that one of the issues with EIDL that folks on the line may or may not be aware of, so I apologize if you are, is that the major difference between what we're doing with PPP and with EIDL is that PPP is going through the 7A program, which is the largest lending program at SBA, and that's a public-private partnership with private institutions. And on the EIDL side, it's money coming directly from SBA. So it's all coming out of SBA's disaster loan programs. And so what we have is just a real, the volume is, as you could imagine, extremely high. And I do think there are some funding issues there that members have been discussing. I don't have any sort of insight into whether there's the plus up of that, what that might look like. But I do know that I think it's been a challenge for SBA to sort of keep up with the demand in that program and to get money out the door. So I know we've heard from a number of folks who are frustrated with that process. And so I would just say that we just don't, we know that there are issues over on that side and we're trying to address them as quickly as we can. My colleague who handles disaster has been really working hard on that. but it's certainly a capacity issue at SBA. I think they've tried to onboard some more staff to help like process applications, get some money out the door, because obviously we have the EIDL loan itself, and then in the CARES Act we included, and this was really worked on by Senator Cardin, our ranking member on the committee, an EIDL grant where you could get an advance of up to $10,000 on that EIDL, that I think has been a source of a lot of stress for folks, and those have been slow coming out the door. So unfortunately.
Got it. Thank you. So you've been tremendously generous with your time. I know you're again really pressed for time today. We'll talk about what's going on the Hill after this, with other folks if you need to jump. Do you have time for one last question or any?
Sure.
If not,
I'm happy to take a few if that, I want to be responsive. So I'm happy to take a few if there are more questions there.
So one question that I think I really want to ask you, and that we've heard from a number of folks, questions about this broadly, is that we in this new environment, we policy advocates that are on with you today are all struggling to learn how to do remote digital advocacy and lobbying. We certainly welcome any tips you have on that, but really fascinated to hear what it's like to try to be a Capitol Hill staffer not on Capitol Hill right now. It is such a location-driven place, a proximity place, right? What's that like? That must be wild.
It's strange. It definitely is. I think for the, and Wes can probably attest to that, the Senate and the House, they're such unique places. The bustle of just, and this time of year is generally our busiest time of year, where we have the most people coming through the halls, meetings, all of that stuff. So that I think that interesting, it's so much of it, you have the same volume of meetings and conversations. They're just all happening the way we're doing it now, either through a webinar, a Zoom, or by phone. So the volume is very similar. I mean, I will say this particular level of volume has been something I've never experienced in my life. Certainly the process of putting the CARES legislation together was, I think, just beyond anything I'd experienced in my 12 years in the Senate. So it's strange. It's a strange time to, because we were in the Senate for about a week while members were negotiating this. And so you have, you're trying to wipe everything down between meetings and make sure all the staff are sitting 6 feet apart and members are sitting 6 feet apart. And so it's challenging. It was challenging, but I think that it just goes to show that people were very, the concern about doing something, we needed to get something more done. And so I'm proud of the work that we did. So it's strange, but the volume is just as high, if that makes sense. You're just at home, you're just at home doing it, with my window here. But I think groups should continue to advocate for their issues the same way they have, and that is reaching out to staff, setting up calls as opposed to meetings. I think we tend to use Zoom a little bit less, I've noticed, than folks that I know who are in the private sector or work for nonprofits, actually. But I think this is a great way to do meetings as well. But continue to do what you're doing. And it's our job, especially during this extraordinary time, to be as responsive as possible to what people in the country are going through. So now more than ever is the time when the Senate we and the staff really should be at beck and call, is my personal view.
Well, we beck and call. We won't hold you in the chairman to that. Those are really.
I do my best with the volume. I'll also say, I always caveat that with, feel free to reach out. I will respond as soon as I can. I don't know that my inbox will ever recover, but I try to get back to people as soon as I can.
We really appreciate it, Renee. And I hope that amidst all of the questions and the interest and the outreach that you're hearing, that you are also hearing profound gratitude from the nonprofit sector. about the Herculean efforts that were put into creating this program and trying to make it work as best as it can for America and for the sector and for most importantly the people that we serve. So thank you again, Renee Bender, Senate Small Business Committee. Thanks for your time, and I think we all look forward to trying to stay in touch with you as best as you're able.
Thank you so much for having me, guys. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Renee.
Thank you.
Thanks, Wes.
So I mentioned that Renee is particularly busy today, even busier than when we talked to her earlier this week. And so there are developments happening on the Hill as we speak, or over the next few hours. Continued posturing that has been going on, but that has, I think, added urgency given the news about the PPP today. So, Wes, can you give us can you flesh that out a little bit more for us about what's going on in Renee's world and, specifically in the Senate today?
Yeah, thanks, man, and Renee did a good job in kind of talking about the issues that are pertinent to this program and to what they're dealing with right now on the Hill. But as she mentioned, the program ran out of funds about 10 o'clock this morning, and they're trying to replenish the fund for the SBA. $349 billion was first allocated, and that's been spent now. And they're still taking applications. I think there's an expectation they will increase the funding. The question just is a matter of when and how that gets done. Leader McConnell has put forth a proposal to increase the program by $250 billion in more funding for the SBA PPP program. The Democrats countered and said we also want to increase some spending and funding for the hospitals and some of the healthcare workers, as well as some state and local governments. And so they've been back and forth into what they can agree to. They're in a unique situation in the sense they have to pass it by UC, unanimous consent, or by voice vote because they're not physically in town to take votes. And so they have to find a way to get an agreement that all members can not object to, both of the House and the Senate. So I think that's the intent of getting that done. And so the House is out today. They're coming back tomorrow for a pro forma session, which is basically a session they don't really do much legislative activity typically, but they could by unanimous consent or voice vote. The Senate is coming back in session at 3 o'clock today in about 20 minutes. And they could pass away unanimous consent if they reach agreement between now and then. My understanding is they will try to do that. I haven't heard any sort of deal being reached at this hour, so possibly that might get pushed off until first part of next week. Maybe Monday or Tuesday, they have the weekend to kind of finalize that package and get it passed first part of next week. So we'll see what happens next hour in the Senate and in the House tomorrow if they actually take something up to try to replenish the SBA funds and some other funding for healthcare providers as well as state and local governments. In addition to that, you also have work ongoing behind the scenes, as Renee mentioned, to kind of make improvements to the programs that are in the CARES Act, the SBA program, the Treasury program, other things that are out there we've talked about today, and also more funding for various programs that might need some more plus-ups as well. And so that conversation is ongoing, and that could also find its way into another larger package sometime in the coming weeks if they reach agreement on that. Really unclear how they can get that done if they're not going to be coming back into town until May 4th for a physical session, and if that that could get pushed back as well. So what do they do between now and the next couple of weeks? It's got to be done through unanimous consent or a voice vote, and so it's going to be hard to do something too major in that time frame, in that circumstance.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful. So folks are welcome to continue to submit questions about the landscape and about the legislative process. I want to work through a couple of the questions that we have gotten so far. Matt Kirsch, an excellent last name, Matt, is asking about an FAQ list or a step-by-step document or maybe even a website tool to walk you through applying for funding, particularly through the PPP I'm imagining. And I would note that that resource does exist at the very top of the independent sector homepage. And we made updates to that resource this morning to reflect the latest developments that we've received before the program ran out of money. But otherwise, the information on that is correct. So would encourage people to check out independentsector.org at the very top for a resource on navigating the CARES Act. A question also that was asked that I think Wes could answer well, nonprofits with pending applications, and I think this applies even to the organizations that maybe we're about to submit, how will those be handled in terms of, when the program gets more money? Presumably it will at some point. How does the prioritization and the order work for that? Or what would you expect? I mean, I know the law is not written yet.
Yeah. So basically the way the program works, you go through your lender and you fill out the 2-page application that the SBA has approved for the PPP program. And then your lender is going to require you to provide some documentation and so forth as part of that underwriting process. Hopefully it's not too much because they're trying to make it as easy as possible for small businesses and nonprofits to apply for this funds and do it quickly through the SBA program. And then you have, once they do that, they kind of file with the SBA. The application said they kind of put it in the queue to the SBA. The SBA will accept it and send you back a number. You've been accepted the SBA. That's kind of puts you in the queue for funding through the SBA program. So my guess is that they're going to probably stop giving those numbers back out from the SBA since their funding is tapped out. They can't approve anymore. But I would still apply through your lender and get it in the queue for the lender to then kind of first come, first serve, hopefully put it through the process when it does open up. As more funding, the SBA turns back on the process so they can then start approving and pushing out more funding to the program. And I think, my sense is there's going to be more money, just the question of when. So I wouldn't stop or pause. If you're in the middle of an application process or thinking about doing an application process, you want to do it, I would go ahead and keep that going or push forward with it with your lender in that expectation that it would open back up and definitely be in the queue for that funding.
Great, thank you. We have someone asking a question about for nonprofit organizations whose lenders are not currently accepting applications. They note Capital One in this instance, and I would direct people to the tool on the independent sector website because for the PPP and at the top of the page, it links to the SBA website where you can find lenders who are participating in this program. I know that some lenders have prioritized existing customers and found other ways of prioritizing, but just because your particular lender is not accepting applications does not mean that you can't go elsewhere. And it sounds, from Renee's perspective, like there is interest in making sure that that financial institutions do have, the ability to make these loans. Wes, we have a question. We've seen a lot of discussion in the press and even in some congressional communications from the House side about the need to include infrastructure in a fourth bill. Can you update us on that process and how Congress is approaching infrastructure? And is infrastructure just roads and bridges?
That's a good question. The Congress has an annual, several multi-year process to reauthorize the Highway Trust Fund, which expires in September of this year. And they try to pass a big, infrastructure / highway road projects bill on a regular basis when it does expire. The Senate EPW committee has passed out a bill that happened last year, and that was expected to come, up debate this summer. There's also, obviously, with the coronavirus and the impact of the economy and unemployment, there's a real desire to do more to stimulate jobs and economic activity throughout the country. And so infrastructure has kind of taken on a new, more urgent aspect, I think, in this next round. And it does include more than just roads and bridges and that kind of traditional stuff. I think there is a sense of building out, internet access. There's infrastructure organizations, people that help. The nonprofit sector can be part of that as well. Education. I think there's a broad perspective here about infrastructure needs that goes beyond simple roads and bridges. I think so. The conversation is ongoing. It's obviously a bigger undertaking. It's going to take a little bit more time to figure out what they can do and how they could fund that. I think there's definitely an interest in doing that, whether that's the next bill or the bill after that. Potentially, they can't get it all done in the short term. I think there is a sense that they're going to do something in that space in the next several months this year. So if there's, I think the sector has interest in some of those areas. I would encourage, the sector has been active in that space to keep raising issues and providing options, suggestions, proposals as part of that process.
So a question from Zachary Hartman that I think is particularly instructive is, I think, a question for all of us. And it's a question about what the nonprofit community's strategy is for including some of the priorities that our community has laid out. And I might start with the priorities that are included in the national sign-on letter that we mentioned to Renee and that is available on the website. What should folks be doing to support that effort? Let me try to answer a little bit of that question, and then I'm sure Wes will have things to add on that as well. So we spent most of our time when we've talked to Renee previously and when we spoke with her today, focusing on issues that are within the Small Business Committee's jurisdiction. And I think that, for issues that are within SBA, we know who some of the key players will be on a final negotiation, on a next negotiation. It'll be House and Senate leadership, and it'll be the leaders of those committees. The 4 key members in the Senate, Chairwoman Velasquez in the House of the House Small Business Committee will have a key role to play. On tax issues, obviously that's leadership and the tax writing committee leads. So those are the people who will be, ultimately, we think, putting pen to paper on these issues. But that doesn't mean that, those of us who don't happen to live in Iowa, don't have a say about what the universal charitable deduction looks like. On big packages like this, the nonprofit community and all advocates need members of Congress to be their advocates behind the scenes. This bill is not going to be marked up in committee with amendments. And so, talking to your legislators about your priorities and getting them to make the case to the people in power is how we need to collectively tackle this moment. One other thing I would flag is that in addition to behind the scenes conversations in the House of Representatives, where which we expect to have maybe a disproportionate influence on the 4th bill, because they seem to be alternating, quite gentlemanly and womanly so. In the House of Representatives, there is legislation introduced, bipartisan legislation, by Congressman Seth Moulton of Massachusetts and Congressman Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania that includes a number of the priorities that are outlined in that letter. And independent sector has been urging our grassroots network to have their representatives co-sponsor that bill. In addition to that bill, those same representatives have a sign-on letter that they circulated, that they started circulating for signature yesterday in the House of Representatives, and that's a letter to leadership making the very same asks in any negotiated package. So urging your representatives to co-sponsor that bill, or if it's in the next, probably day or two, to sign on to that letter are two action items that I think we would want to particularly charge advocates with in the House of Representatives. So why don't I pause there and see what else Wes has to add on that question?
I think that's good, Ben. I think that it's important now as they go through this next phase, as Renee mentioned, to kind of re-examine the programs they passed in the CARES Act, and they're trying to make them work for everyone to make sure that our voice is heard, make the case that we need to make some modifications to that, and then also be heard in the next phase, the fourth phase really of this legislation, that when they do more, because there's going to be more need out there for sure in the funding space and economic activity space and helping the sector and other parts of the economy, that we kind of educate members of Congress that what we're seeing in our communities and our organizations and how they can be helpful, what we need, and kind of don't be shy about talking to your local congressman or senator about those issues. They are aware and educated about these things. So they're just getting a lot of information, and so it would be good if it came from us and they were kind of thinking about us in their as they put things together.
That'd be nice, yeah. So a question, Wes, and I know I've seen this in congressional documents. I don't know if it's on the tip of your tongue or not, but the nonprofit sector spent a lot of time last year talking about public transit when we were trying to get the UBIT tax repealed. Public transit systems and transportation systems are facing particular stress right now. Our workforce relies, disproportionately on public transportation in a lot of cities. Do you get the sense that there will be assistance directly for public transit agencies going forward, or should we be looking more towards, is that going to be done maybe through more assistance to state and local governments? What do you think the outlook on that might be?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think probably in this next phase, they'll probably more just general funding to the states, local governments, then they can use it how they best prioritize. But infrastructure legislation in the next phase will have probably more targeted funding for various transit programs, activities, I would think, in that phase. Doesn't mean they couldn't do it now, but I think that probably now looking more general state and local government relief to help them prioritize how they want to use that funding. In the infrastructure bill, I think they would have definitely targeted funding for transit, et cetera, in that package.
Great, thank you. One other topic that I want to highlight, it has been a focus of independent sectors, and we believe is of vital importance to the sector and to civil society, is funding for election security. So again, IS asked Congress in the CARES Act to include in the range of $2 billion for election security. That's not a number that we came up with on our own, but one that was developed by experts on election security about what's necessary in order to make sure that come November, people are not choosing between their civil rights to vote and their health. So we saw some money in CARES for that, and I know IS will be continuing to advocate alongside a lot of other excellent organizations for more money for election security. And so I guess my question for Wes would be, we didn't see anything about more, what you would call, right, just a few $100 million kind of nitty gritty appropriations priorities in a package this size. We didn't see anything from them, from House leadership in their counteroffer do you think there will be another appropriations title of significant size and complexity in any fourth bill that the House writes? Do you think we'll have another crack at the appropriations apple?
Yes. Yeah, I think the fourth, phase 4 bill, if you will, however they're going to call it, will have additional appropriated funds for various areas and programs, kind of across the board. Not everything, but I think it'll be substantial in the sense that they will do more funding for different things. I have seen, I don't remember who it was. There were different, I think, conversations on the Hill, members who are interested in this space, pushing for more funding in the election space. So there's interest in doing that. I'm not sure how much, but I think that there is going to be an appropriations title, and hopefully it will include election funding for that interest.
Great, thank you. And so there are a few other outstanding questions that are a bit more technical in nature. They're really valid questions, but I think it would be better if we answer some of those questions individually. And so for our last question, someone's asking about the motivation behind the 500 employee cap, and I think, as we know in our business, understanding what legislators were trying to get at is important to influencing them in the future and into influencing the agencies. So the question's about, is the idea that large organizations, well, they didn't need grants and so they could survive on loans because they're larger, or what's the rationale for limiting these grants to small, under 500 organizations? I've got some thoughts on that are more maybe procedural in nature, but anything that jumps out to you, Wes?
Yeah, I think it's the just by virtue of the program they decided to use is the SBA. The SBA has traditionally been a small business lender, and we talked about size standards that vary by industry based on revenue or employees. It goes from 100 employees up to 1,500 employees, and the size standards. Some have a $5 million revenue cap, a $35 million revenue cap, something like that. So it's all like the issue was that because they decided to use the SBA 7A program as the vehicle to put money out, they're kind of stuck with the current SBA rules. And as she mentioned, they kind of didn't want to just use those rules as they stood, but you say, okay, we'll give everybody at least a 500 employee threshold. So if you're smaller than that, you're fine. And then obviously some people can get bigger than that based on SBA size, but kind of cap it at that. And they also put out another program through the Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve, the Main Street Lending Program for larger businesses, 500 to 10,000 employees. And so the idea was smaller businesses get relief out quickly through the SBA, make it a more of a grant program, and larger businesses make it a loan program through the Fed and Treasury, and hopefully, both parts of the economy are covered. I think they realized, that didn't work out exactly like they'd hoped. And there's obviously gaps, and hopefully they can kind of try to fix some of that in the next couple rounds of legislation. I think that's kind of thinking behind why it was capped at 500, because of the SBA program used was traditionally a small business program. Want to do too much through it and keep it fairly narrow, limited.
So I'd certainly agree. I would make a point of agreeing with Wes's analysis. I think that for me, my takeaway from this is, as we noted to Renee, this relationship that the nonprofit sector has right now with the SBA is a new one, and like any new relationship has its bumps, and is maybe an imperfect fit. And as we look to the future, I have to believe that the sector as a whole is thinking about what would be a better fit, and what would be maybe a more appropriate fit with the nonprofit sector in the federal government. And there are a lot of ideas to explore there that we'd be interested in continuing to think with you all about. And on that note, I want to thank you again for joining us this afternoon. we have been having these conversations with the policy advocacy community every Thursday at 2 p.m. And we hope you will join us next Thursday at 2 p.m. for another update on the constantly changing implementation of the CARES Act and further legislation needed to address this public health crisis and ensure that the nonprofit community can continue to meet its mission throughout it. So again, thank you for joining us. We hope to see you next Thursday. Please fill out the survey that you will get. And thank you again to Renee, and as always to Wes Coulam and his team at Washington Council. Thank you for joining us. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.